You look out the front window of the squat one-room cabin you've been living in for the past few months, ever since your husband got a job working for the Cambria Iron Company in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The life you've built here is better than the one you had back in Europe, but not by much. You start working the second the sun comes out and don't stop until it's disappeared behind the horizon. Washing clothes, cooking enough food to feed your growing family, and doing it all on the limited pay that your husband brings home, it's a lot. As for the work your husband does, you shiver. His days are shorter than yours, only 12 hours most of the time compared to your 18, but the work he does is so dangerous, it frightens you just to think about it. You'll never forget the first time you heard the siren go off, the one that only rings when a factory worker has been injured or killed. Your husband got lucky that day. His friend did not. The man actually died after another worker accidentally hit him in the head with a steel beam. But what really worries you is your husband's weight. He's lost nearly 50 pounds since he started working in the factory. He says not to worry, that it's just a result of all the sweating he does every day. And you know that the iron factory is hot. It has to be. Heat, after all, is what ultimately turns iron into steel. But today, you're not thinking about the heat, or your husband's dwindling frame, or even the dangers that lurk within the factory walls. Instead, you're thinking about the rain that's coming down in a torrent outside, the water creeping down the street and lapping at the baseboards of your house. You look around. This cabin isn't much to look at, but it's kept you and your family safe for months. If it floods, you'll be in real trouble. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1889, the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, one of the first true company towns to spring up during America's industrial age, was almost literally washed away when a dam, resting in the Allegheny Mountains above, broke and unleashed nearly 20 million tons of water on the unsuspecting people below. The damage inflicted on the community was, in many ways, impossible to measure, but a few statistics featured on the website for the Heritage Johnstown Museum help highlight the impact of the flooding on the community. Statistic number 1. In total, 2,209 people died. 396 of those were children. Statistic number 2. 99 entire families were wiped out. Statistic number 3. 124 women were widowed, as were 198 men. Statistic number 4. More than 750 bodies were never identified. These victims are buried in Grandview Cemetery near the community of Johnstown in a place called the Plot of the Unknown. Statistic number 5. In terms of property damage, 1,600 homes were destroyed, and approximately $17 million worth of damage was done. Statistic number 6. This event held the record for the largest loss of life on American soil in a single day until the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. What do these statistics tell us? In short, the flood was catastrophic. It ended thousands of lives and forever altered thousands more. And it sparked, within people everywhere, a deep desire to know how. How had this happened? Was it a natural disaster? An unavoidable act of God? Or was it something else? Something man-made? Something preventable? Join me on this season of History Magnified as I investigate some of the most deadly disasters to ever occur on American soil, both natural and unnatural. Today, we'll explore the events that led up to the Johnstown Flood, as well as the painful aftermath and the disturbing lack of legal accountability for those responsible for the devastation. I'm your host, Shaylin Montgomery, and this is Episode 2, The Johnstown Flood. In 1889, Johnstown was a company town, owned and operated, in many respects anyway, by the Cambria Iron Company. But this was actually a relatively new development. In the 1820s, Johnstown had been nothing more than a small farming community, but the industrial age had changed all that. First, a canal project had moved into the area. Initially, the canal's amazing ability to move products from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in a mere 3 days was seen as borderline miraculous. Just 20 years later, however, the Pennsylvania Railroad had set up a station in town, making the canal obsolete. The railroad had made traveling to Johnstown not only possible, but easy, at least in the context of the time period. And soon, industrial businessmen had decided that this once obscure outpost would be the perfect location for a new steel manufacturing plant. Enter the Cambria Iron Company. On the upside, the company provided jobs for locals as well as the immigrants that were pouring into the United States at a rate never seen before. People from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Scandinavia, Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, Bohemia, Hungary, and Slovakia, as well as Jews fleeing European persecution. Of course, racism being what it is, many of these immigrants, especially those hailing from Eastern Europe, were given the lowest paying jobs available, while Jews were forbidden from working in the steel mills at all. In truth, though, this may have been a blessing. Working conditions inside the Cambria Iron Company's steel mills were poor, to say the least. In his book Ruthless Tide, Al Roker describes a typical day at the iron factory like this. Quote, "Shifts were 12 hours long, in some factories 7 days a week, often with no time to eat or even take a break, except for those few minutes when a machine had to be oiled." And danger was rampant, as Roker also acknowledges. Quote, "Slag piles fell and buried the men. Ladles tipped molten steel on them. Iron and steel beams cracked their skulls. Coal seared them. Steam scalded them. And all this for a wage that can only be described as a pittance." This was, after all, Twain's Gilded Age, an era of American history marked by rampant greed and political corruption, a time when the gap between the richest of America's rich and the poorest of America's poor was growing every day. Nowhere was this gap more evident than in the factories that ran on wage labor, factories like the ones owned and operated by the Cambria Iron Company in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. But perhaps the most serious problems caused by factories, like the Cambria Iron Company, weren't just social or even political in nature. They were environmental. Let me explain. When the rain started falling down in sheets on May 30th, 1889, most Johnstown residents were not alarmed, or even surprised. But 100 years earlier, the reaction would have been very different. For one thing, the very factories that had increased the population of Johnstown from 15,000 to 30,000 in less than 10 years had also polluted the region in ways that, even today, are hard to imagine. As Roker describes it, the smoke issuing from the factories laid, quote, "a haze of stink along the valleys." As a result, by 1889, quote, "birds no longer sang in Johnstown. The trees had all turned black and never leafed anymore, and fish no longer jumped in the rivers." To make matters worse, excessive lumbering in the Allegheny Mountains had stripped the area of the natural protection that trees provide. And so, when the downpour began on that Thursday in late May, Johnstown was, despite the blissful ignorance of local residents, primed for destruction. Given the pollution that stained the skies around Johnstown, it seems rather odd that some of the most innovative minds of the late 19th century, like Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, and Henry Clay Frick, would turn to that very area when seeking a natural respite from the mechanical crush of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And yet, that's exactly what they did. In 1879, 10 years before the flood that would cause so much suffering, these men, along with other wealthy friends, founded the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The purpose of the club was simple: to provide the most powerful men in Pennsylvania with a luxurious mountain retreat where their families could socialize with one another. And, as bass fishing was among the most popular sports for gentlemen at the turn of the century, it was imperative that this mountain retreat come equipped with a fishable lake. Unfortunately, no such lake existed in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. But Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, and their associates were not the kind of men to walk away from a promising project simply because nature was refusing to cooperate. To these titans of industry, most of whom, at this point in their lives, were unfamiliar with the word no, the solution was obvious. If nature would not supply a lake, then men would have to do it. And in the pursuit of this endeavor, the abandoned canal at Johnstown would prove an invaluable asset. To make the canal work, a reservoir had been built, and then abandoned. In 1879, it was purchased by the administration of the South Fork Club with one goal in mind: to use the reservoir's earthen dam to make an artificial lake for fishing. On the surface, this plan is rather ingenious. Instead of creating a whole new dam, the people building the club's headquarters would simply utilize an existing structure, saving both time and money. Moreover, the dam had originally been constructed by qualified engineers working for the government on improving the country's infrastructure. Surely the dam would be solid. And it had been, once. But for more than 2 decades, that old earthen edifice had been sitting abandoned in the mountains above Johnstown. During that time, leaks had begun to form, and in 1862, the discharge culvert had suffered a partial collapse. And yet, when the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club began repairing the dam in 1879, the person appointed to oversee the work was Benjamin Ruff, a businessman with no civil engineering experience and a greater concern for money than for safety. Thus, the repair work was shoddy, to say the least. In his article for the Geo Institute, author Michael Bennett describes that repair work like this, saying, quote, "The crew first removed the discharge pipes. Now no one could control the lake levels. The laborers also lowered the crest of the dam by about 3 feet, which significantly lowered the peak discharge of the main spillway and reduced the auxiliary spillway to a mere drainage swale." To make matters worse, Ruff installed a fishing screen which was intended to improve the fishing experience of the club's guests. Unfortunately, it also obstructed the lake's spillway. And while hindsight is undoubtedly 20/20, the inadequacy of Ruff's improvements were obvious even in 1879. News of the poor workmanship eventually reached the ears of Daniel Morrell, general manager of the Cambria Iron Company. Morrell sent John Fulton, a trusted employee with a background in civil engineering, to examine the site. The report Fulton filed on his return was dire. He said, quote, "When the full head of 60 feet is reached, it appears to me to be only a question of time until the former cutting breach is repeated. Should this break be made during a season of flood, it is evident that considerable damage would ensue." A horrified Morrell sent that report on to Benjamin Ruff, who completely disregarded it. And in 1881, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club officially opened the doors of its brand new clubhouse and encouraged guests to bask in the beauty of its man-made lake. When the rainfall began on May 30th, 1889, 10 years had passed since the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had completed construction on its clubhouse, and as yet, Fulton's dire prediction had not come to pass. This despite a number of bad storms and seasons of flooding over the preceding decade. And so, on that fateful day, most of the residents of Johnstown never even considered the possibility that the dam resting high above their heads might break. But it did. At 3:10 on the afternoon of May 31st, 1889, the South Fork Dam, which had been so carefully built back in the 1850s and then so haphazardly rebuilt in 1879, gave way, releasing 20 million tons of water on the unsuspecting heads of the people below. A little less than an hour later, that water, now heavy with the weight of tree branches, livestock, and homes that had once rested on the hillside between the town and the dam, blasted into Johnstown with all the destructive power of an explosion. It's hard to imagine the kind of overwhelming destruction that could be wrought by those 20 million tons of raging water and debris. Perhaps the only way to gauge the impact of such destruction is by looking at the stories of survivors, several of which have been preserved by the Heritage Johnstown Museum. One such survivor is Anna Finn. When she woke up on the morning of May 31st, she was a wife and a mother. By the time the sun set that evening, she was neither. The terrible storm of water unleashed by the poorly reconstructed dam had taken both her husband and all 7 of her children. Sometime after the flood, she described her experience like this, saying, quote, "What I suffered with the bodies of my 7 children floating around me in the gloom can never be told." To make matters worse, the newly widowed and childless Anna was pregnant. A few weeks after the disaster, she gave birth, but the child did not survive. Eventually, Anna remarried and took on the name Anna Maxwell. She had no more children, but she lived nearly 40 years more, passing away in 1928. She's buried in Grandview Cemetery, the same cemetery that holds the bodies of the flood victims who were never identified, including 5 of Anna's own children. Another survivor, Victor Heiser, was only 16 years old when the massive floodwaters crushed the home he'd grown up in, as well as the barn he'd turned to for shelter. His parents were quickly washed away. Victor never saw them again. But Victor himself endured by clinging to a piece of debris as he navigated the vicious wave. Eventually, he found refuge in a brick home populated by other survivors. Victor went on to become a well-known and respected doctor who is credited with saving over 2 million lives. Fortunately, not all stories end tragically. The Waters family, for instance, survived intact, despite the fact that, due to a remodeling project, they'd been forced to stand on narrow joists in the unfinished attic as the water rose precipitously around them. Even their son, who'd been staying with a friend when the water hit, was eventually returned to them unharmed. The Reverend H.L. Chapman, his family, and others who'd turned to the parsonage for safety were likewise spared, as was the Franklin Street Methodist Church where the Reverend Chapman was employed. In fact, it was the church that, somewhat miraculously, diluted the power of the wave just enough to protect several of the buildings behind it, including both the parsonage and Alma Hall, a large and sturdy building in which more than 200 people were huddling together and waiting for the nightmare to end. But fate had one more card to play. To understand what happened at 6 o'clock on the evening of May 31st, one must first remember that Johnstown was a company town. More specifically, it was an iron company town. And so when the great wave unleashed by the breaking of the South Fork Dam thundered through the streets of Johnstown, it collected not only bodies and houses and all the usual type of debris, it also collected steam engines, boilers, kerosene lamps, oil lamps, natural gas lines, and of course, molten iron and steel. As Al Roker said, it was, quote, "a highly combustible tinderbox with chemical reactions too powerful, despite all the water, to be dampened." Sure enough, when that furious tide full of dangerously flammable materials collided with the Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge, it sparked an inferno. One might hope that, by this point, the bridge would have been abandoned, but it wasn't. Instead, it was packed with people who'd already survived the first horrors of the day by jumping from pieces of floating debris onto the apparent safety of the bridge, whose sturdy bulk stood well above the water from which they'd just escaped. Now those same people faced a new enemy. It's impossible to know, at least based on the research that I conducted, how many people died or were injured due to the fire. But the stone bridge, while allowing for an incendiary pileup that undoubtedly added to the horror of the day, ultimately led to the end of the destruction. An unwavering structure, it absorbed much of the wave's intensity. As a result, once past the bridge, the waters finally began to calm. Even so, the devastation left behind, by the flood, by the failure of the dam, and more broadly, by the unrelenting desire for progress that defined America during the Industrial Age, was complete. For the survivors, more than 10,000 of whom were left homeless, the future looked grim. Five days after the disaster, on June 5th, help arrived. It came in the form of a small but determined woman and the 50 volunteers who accompanied her. The woman's name was Clara Barton. The people with her were volunteers for the organization she'd founded just 8 years earlier, in 1881, the American Red Cross. Over the next 5 months, Barton and her team of hard-working helpers sorted donations, which were arriving from all over the country and the world, built temporary shelters known as Red Cross hotels for the displaced locals, and provided medical care for the sick and injured. According to the website for the Red Cross, quote, more than 25,000 people were served during this disaster relief operation. Barton herself stayed in Johnstown overseeing relief efforts until late October, and according to the website for the Heritage Johnstown Museum, the local survivors were so grateful to her that they, quote, gave her a gold pin and a locket set in diamonds and amethysts as a farewell present. 3 years later, the people remained grateful, so much so that when the American Red Cross began working to provide aid to those in Russia who'd been suffering due to famine, the Johnstown survivors gathered $2,596, worth around $90,000 in today's money, to send to her. But what of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club? The public was horrified by the club's actions. As Roker explains it, quote, a mine cave-in or factory explosion was bad enough, death and disaster in the service of profit, but Johnstown was death and disaster in the service of relaxation and enjoyment. Unfortunately, public sentiment and legal accountability are two very different things. To make matters worse, everyone knew that Benjamin Ruff, the club's co-founder, had been the one to oversee the sloppy repair work on the South Fork Dam 10 years earlier, making him, in many ways, the most legally culpable. But Ruff had died in 1887, 2 years before the disaster. As for the other members of the club, well, a few faced civil suits, all of which ultimately proved futile, but the most prominent among them did what the wealthy have done for centuries when faced with a problem. They threw money at it, with varying degrees of both success and sincerity. Andrew Mellon's family donated $1,000 to the relief efforts, while Henry Clay Frick offered up $5,000. But the largest donation, $10,000, came from Andrew Carnegie, who also promised to rebuild the town's library, which had been lost during the flood. In a full-circle moment, that library now houses the Johnstown Flood Museum. The people of Johnstown were so moved by Carnegie's generosity that when he personally visited the crippled city in November 1889, he was met not by an angry mob, but by an awestruck crowd of locals who hailed him as a hero. I'm Shaylin Montgomery, and this has been the Johnstown Flood. Come back on October 20th for the next episode of History Magnified.